Der einzige Mensch der Welt, der 2 ganze Tage lang ohne Sauerstoff und ohne jegliche Ausrüstung am Meeresboden überlebt hat. War es Schicksal, das ihm gnädig war, oder hat der Tod ihn einfach nicht gefunden? Harrison, a Nigerian man, was involved in a terrifying accident at sea when he, along with 12 other crew members, was sent to assist an oil tanker stranded in the Gulf of Guinea. The mission initially seemed like a routine operation, one that the crew had completed many times before. The oil tanker was located 32 kilometers off the Nigerian coast, and the goal was simple: help tow the ship back to safety. However, what started as a normal day quickly escalated into a nightmare that would leave Harrison fighting for his life. It was early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m., when the crew began their efforts to secure the oil tanker with ropes. They were using a tugboat to assist in pulling the tanker to safety. The situation seemed manageable at first, and the crew carried on with their work without expecting any issues. But then, disaster struck. A massive, unexpected wave rose from the depths of the ocean and crashed into the tugboat with immense force. This powerful wave caused the tugboat to lose its balance and capsize, flipping it over in the middle of the ocean. The force of the wave was so strong that it broke the ropes attached to the oil tanker, causing the tugboat to become completely detached. It sank rapidly, disappearing beneath the waves, leaving the crew stranded in the middle of the ocean. The situation was terrifying, and the crew had no idea what to do next. The accident caused chaos aboard the tugboat. The crew members, many of whom had been in their cabins at the time of the accident, were now trapped inside. Their cabins, which were locked for safety reasons, proved to be more of a curse than a blessing. The doors could not be opened, and soon water began flooding the cabins. This left the crew with limited options. Most of them were stuck inside, unable to escape as the water quickly filled the small compartments. Harrison, however, was fortunate to be one of the few crew members not trapped in a cabin. Just before the accident occurred, he had left his cabin to use the restroom. This decision, seemingly insignificant at the time, turned out to be a lifesaver. While the rest of the crew was trapped, Harrison found himself alone, stranded in the cold, dark water of the ocean. He was wearing only his underwear, and the wave that had capsized the boat had thrown him into the depths of the sea. In the freezing cold and complete darkness, Harrison was faced with an overwhelming challenge. He had no experience in deep water survival, and the situation seemed hopeless. The ocean was vast and unforgiving, and he had no idea where he was or how to escape. All he could do was try to stay afloat and hope that he would be found. The darkness was so intense that he couldn't even see his own hands, let alone figure out which direction to swim. As he struggled to stay alive, he knew that he had no time to waste. His only chance of survival was to keep moving and find a way to escape. Despite the overwhelming odds, Harrison's determination and survival instincts kicked in. As he struggled to keep his head above water, he realized that he needed to find something to hold on to. He started looking for any objects that could provide support, and soon he found some floating debris. Among the floating debris, he discovered a few cans of Coke, which he quickly drank to prevent dehydration. While this was a small victory, Harrison knew that the real challenge lay in finding a safe place to wait for rescue. The cold water was rapidly draining his energy, and he knew that hypothermia was a real risk. The longer he stayed in the freezing ocean, the more likely it was that his body would give out. But Harrison refused to give up. He kept searching for anything that could help him survive, and eventually, he found a small compartment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a place to rest. The compartment was small and cramped, and it barely had enough oxygen to sustain him. But it was the best option he had. The oxygen in the small compartment was running low, and Harrison knew that time was running out. He couldn't stay in the compartment forever. The water was rising, and he needed to find a way out before he was trapped. But just as things seemed at their darkest, Harrison heard something. It was a faint noise, like the sound of a knock. Harrison couldn't believe his ears. Was it a rescue team? Was someone coming to save him? The sound came closer. and soon Harrison saw a faint light in the distance. It was the light of a rescue diver who had been sent down by the oil tanker's crew to search for survivors. The diver had no idea that Harrison was alive and trapped in the wreckage. But Harrison, weak and exhausted, had managed to make enough noise to alert the rescue team. As the diver approached, Harrison felt a surge of hope. He was not going to die alone in the dark waters of the Gulf of Guinea. The diver quickly administered oxygen to Harrison and began the process of getting him out of the water. However, due to the extreme pressure change, they couldn't immediately bring him to the surface. Instead, Harrison was placed in a diving bell, where the pressure was gradually reduced before he could be safely brought to the surface. After being rescued, Harrison spent 2 more days in the diving bell, recovering from the ordeal. His body was severely weakened, but he was alive. Once he was brought to safety, he was rushed to the hospital for further treatment. Harrison had survived the impossible, spending 2 full days at the bottom of the ocean, without oxygen and with minimal resources. His story was one of extraordinary survival against all odds. This terrifying experience left a lasting impact on Harrison. He had faced death and come out victorious, but the psychological scars remained. He vowed never to go near the ocean again, and he continues to be haunted by nightmares of the ordeal. Harrison's story is a testament to the power of the human will to survive, even in the most impossible circumstances. The tragic event unfolded when a massive wave suddenly appeared from the deep, crashing into the tugboat with incredible force. The wave, seemingly out of nowhere, was so powerful that it overturned the tugboat, causing it to flip completely. In a split second, the once sturdy vessel was now sinking into the depths of the ocean, and the crew found themselves caught in a desperate struggle for survival. At the time of the accident, the tugboat was operating in the Gulf of Guinea, located approximately 32 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria. Harrison and his 12 crew members had been tasked with assisting an oil tanker that had broken down and needed help. The crew, accustomed to such operations, were focused on securing the tanker with ropes to tow it back to safety. However, this seemingly routine mission turned into a life-threatening disaster when the colossal wave struck. The force of the wave was so intense that it threw the tugboat off balance. The boat tipped over, its hull upended, and within moments, the vessel began to sink. The crew, who were mostly in their cabins at the time, found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The force of the water was so strong that it broke the ropes that had been securing the tugboat to the oil tanker, causing the boat to completely detach and plunge into the ocean. As the tugboat capsized, the crew members, who had been in the process of securing the tanker, were now trapped in their cabins. For safety reasons, the crew had locked their cabins. This was a standard precaution to protect themselves from pirates, who were known to be a threat in the region. However, in this tragic moment, the locked cabins became their prison. The water began flooding the boat at a rapid rate, filling the cabins and sealing the crew inside. It was a horrifying reality for those trapped below deck. The locked cabins, which were meant to provide security from external threats, now offered no protection against the overwhelming force of nature. The crew members, confined to these small, cramped spaces, were left with no means of escape. As the water continued to rise, the trapped crew members were left fighting against the odds, hoping for a miracle. Harrison, however, was not trapped in a cabin. Just before the wave hit, he had left his cabin to use the restroom. In what seemed like an ordinary decision at the time, Harrison's quick thinking proved to be the key to his survival. As the wave struck and the tugboat overturned, Harrison was thrown into the freezing, dark waters of the ocean. Unlike the others, who were trapped inside their cabins, Harrison had a chance to survive, though he was now alone in the vast, unyielding sea. The chaotic situation aboard the capsized tugboat was one that no one could have anticipated. The crew members inside the locked cabins had no way of knowing what was happening outside. They were completely cut off from the outside world, with no communication and no hope of rescue. As the water flooded the cabins, they were left in complete darkness, with no way to escape. Meanwhile, Harrison, now in the ocean, found himself in a desperate struggle to stay afloat. The cold water was numbing and the darkness was suffocating. Harrison had no idea which way to swim, and the ocean seemed endless. He had no survival training, no equipment, and no clue about what to do next. All he could do was keep his head above water and try to stay alive. His only chance was to survive long enough for someone to find him. In those terrifying moments, Harrison's mind raced. He knew that his chances of survival were slim, but he refused to give up. As he floated in the cold water, he kept his eyes open for any signs of hope. He knew that if he stayed still, he would eventually be swept away by the currents. But if he kept moving, there was a chance, however slim, that he could survive. The rest of the crew, trapped in their cabins, had no idea of Harrison's struggle. They were powerless to help themselves or each other. As the boat sank further into the ocean, the water levels inside the cabins rose rapidly. The crew members, locked in their rooms, could do nothing but wait for their inevitable fate. Meanwhile, Harrison's struggle in the ocean continued. He had no idea how far the boat had sunk, but he knew that the deeper the boat went, the less chance there was of anyone coming to their rescue. The ocean seemed like a vast, unforgiving expanse, and Harrison had no way of knowing if help was even on the way. He was alone, surrounded by nothing but the cold, dark water. As the tugboat sank deeper into the ocean, Harrison knew that time was running out. The longer he remained in the water, the more likely it was that he would succumb to the elements. He had no food, no water, and no shelter. His only hope was that someone would eventually find him before it was too late. The rest of the crew, trapped in their cabins, shared a similar fate. They had no way of knowing if anyone was even searching for them. The locked cabins had become their tombs, and they were left with nothing but the rising water and the dark, silent ocean outside. In the end, it was Harrison's decision to leave his cabin just before the waves struck that ultimately saved his life. His quick thinking allowed him to escape the sinking boat and find a chance at survival. However, the rest of the crew was not so lucky. The locked cabins that had once provided safety from pirates now became their prison, sealing them inside as the boat sank deeper into the ocean. The tragic fate of the crew highlights the unpredictability and danger of the ocean. What started as a routine mission turned into a horrifying ordeal, with the crew facing death at every turn. For Harrison, survival seemed impossible. But against all odds, he managed to cling to life and keep fighting, hoping that someone would eventually come to his rescue. As the tugboat sank into the depths of the ocean, Harrison was thrust into a terrifying situation unlike anything he had ever experienced. With no survival training, no equipment, and no prior experience in such extreme conditions, Harrison found himself alone in the freezing cold waters, trapped inside a tiny compartment with barely any oxygen. His mind raced, and his body trembled from the cold, but he knew he had to stay focused if he was to have any chance of survival. The compartment where Harrison ended up was small, confined, and claustrophobic. It was a tiny space, barely large enough for him to stretch his limbs. The walls of the compartment were submerged in the cold, dark ocean water, and Harrison had no way of knowing if the compartment would stay afloat for much longer. The lack of oxygen inside the compartment made his situation even more dire. He could feel his breath becoming shallower, and he knew that with each passing moment, the chances of survival were growing slimmer. The cold water seemed to seep into his very bones, numbing him to the core. He had never been exposed to such conditions before, and the extreme cold quickly took a toll on his body. His limbs became stiff and unresponsive, and his chest felt tight as his body struggled to conserve warmth. The darkness around him was suffocating, and he could barely make out anything in the pitch-black waters. The only sound he could hear was the faint rush of the water around him and his own labored breathing. In this small, submerged compartment, Harrison was cut off from the rest of the world. There was no way to know if help was on the way, and he had no means of communication. He was completely isolated, floating in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by nothing but the cold, dark water. The pressure of the water outside the compartment was intense, and Harrison knew that the deeper he sank, the more dangerous it would become. The lack of oxygen made it even harder to think clearly. and Harrison's mind began to cloud with panic. Despite the overwhelming fear and uncertainty, Harrison refused to give up. He knew that if he let the panic take over, he would have no chance of survival. He focused on controlling his breathing, trying to conserve the little oxygen that remained in the compartment. Each breath was a struggle, and the air felt heavier with each passing second. The oxygen supply inside the small space was running out quickly, and Harrison knew that if he didn't find a way to escape, he wouldn't last much longer. Harrison's body began to shut down from the cold. Hypothermia set in, causing his body temperature to drop rapidly. The cold water made it difficult to move, and his muscles became weak and unresponsive. In this vulnerable state, Harrison knew that survival would depend on his ability to think clearly and make the right decisions. He realized that he needed to find a way out of the compartment before it was too late. With limited oxygen and no way to escape, Harrison began to search the compartment for any possible exit. His hands groped the cold, slick walls of the compartment, desperately searching for a way out. He knew that if he didn't find a way to get out, he would be trapped forever, slowly suffocating as the oxygen ran out. As he searched the small compartment, Harrison's thoughts turned to his fellow crew members. He knew that they were still trapped in their cabins, unable to escape the rising water. He had no way of knowing if they were alive or if they were still fighting for survival. But in that moment, all he could do was focus on his own survival. He couldn't afford to waste time thinking about anything else. The cold water around him seemed to grow colder with each passing minute, and Harrison's body began to tremble uncontrollably. His muscles ached from the cold, and his vision became blurry as his body struggled to cope with the extreme conditions. He was losing hope, but he refused to give in to despair. He knew that if he gave up, it would be the end. In the darkness of the compartment, Harrison's thoughts turned to survival strategies. He knew that he couldn't stay in the compartment forever, but he also knew that he had no way of getting out on his own. The pressure of the water outside was immense, and the thought of trying to escape into the open ocean was terrifying. But despite the fear, Harrison knew that he had no other choice. He had to find a way to survive, no matter how impossible it seemed. After what felt like hours in the freezing dark compartment, Harrison's efforts to stay calm and conserve oxygen began to pay off. He managed to remain relatively still, focusing on his breathing and trying to stay as warm as possible. The cold was still unbearable, but he was determined to hold on. Every minute that passed without him succumbing to the cold or lack of oxygen brought him a little closer to hope. Suddenly, Harrison's ears perked up as he heard a faint sound in the distance. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then he heard it again, this time louder. It was a faint tapping sound, coming from the direction of the tugboat's wreckage. Harrison's heart raced with excitement. Could it be someone searching for survivors? Could help finally be on the way? With his remaining strength, Harrison pushed himself up against the compartment walls and tried to orient himself toward the source of the sound. He could barely move. His body ached from the cold, but the thought of rescue gave him the strength to push forward. The tapping grew louder, and Harrison's hope surged. Harrison knew that he couldn't afford to wait any longer. If he wanted to survive, he had to take action. With a final push, he managed to break free from the compartment, leaving the safety of the small space behind. He didn't know what awaited him outside, but he knew that it was his only chance to survive. In the freezing cold and darkness of the ocean, Harrison clung to the hope that help was near, and with that hope, he fought to stay alive. In extremen Klimabedingungen oder bei intensiver körperlicher Belastung kann der menschliche Körper leicht dehydrieren. Eine der unkonventionellen Methoden, mit denen Menschen versuchen, ihre Hydratation zu bewahren und den Flüssigkeitsverlust zu minimieren, ist die Verwendung von Säuren. Diese Methode mag seltsam erscheinen, aber sie wird von manchen als nützlich angesehen, um den Körper zu hydrieren und den Wasserhaushalt zu stabilisieren. Der menschliche Körper besteht zu einem großen Teil aus Wasser, und es ist entscheidend, dass der Körper regelmäßig ausreichend Flüssigkeit erhält, um richtig zu funktionieren. In heißen Klimazonen oder bei starkem Schwitzen durch körperliche Aktivität verliert der Körper schnell Flüssigkeit. Wenn der Wasserhaushalt nicht ausgeglichen wird, kann es zu einer Dehydrierung kommen, was zu ernsthaften gesundheitlichen Problemen führen kann. Daher ist es wichtig, den Körper kontinuierlich zu hydratisieren. Einige Menschen, insbesondere in extrem heißen Klimazonen, haben begonnen, ungewöhnliche Methoden anzuwenden, um ihre Hydratation aufrechtzuerhalten. Eine dieser Methoden ist der Konsum von Säuren. Die Theorie hinter dieser Praxis beruht auf der Annahme, dass bestimmte Säuren dazu beitragen können, den Körper zu hydratisieren und die Auswirkungen von Flüssigkeitsverlust zu verringern. Es gibt viele verschiedene Arten von Säuren, die in Lebensmitteln und Getränken vorkommen. Einige dieser Säuren, wie Zitronensäure, Apfelsäure und Essigsäure, sind natürlich und werden vom Körper gut vertragen, wenn sie in moderaten Mengen konsumiert werden. Diese Säuren, die oft in Obst wie Zitronen oder Äpfeln enthalten sind, sollen helfen, den pH-Wert des Körpers auszugleichen und die Hydratation zu unterstützen. Zitronensäure, die in Zitrusfrüchten vorkommt, wird oft verwendet, weil sie helfen kann, das Säure-Basen-Gleichgewicht im Körper zu stabilisieren. Apfelessig, der Essigsäure enthält, wird ebenfalls als nützlich angesehen, um die Flüssigkeitsaufnahme zu verbessern, da er die Verdauung unterstützt und den Elektrolythaushalt reguliert. Einige Menschen berichten von positiven Ergebnissen, wenn sie Säuren konsumieren, um ihre Hydratation aufrechtzuerhalten. Ein Vorteil ist die Unterstützung der Wasserspeicherung im Körper. Wenn der Körper genug Flüssigkeit hat, kann er die Temperatur besser regulieren, was besonders in heißen Umgebungen wichtig ist. Darüber hinaus kann der Konsum von Säuren die Verdauung fördern und den Körper bei der Entgiftung unterstützen. Ein weiterer Vorteil des Säurekonsums ist, dass er die Aufnahme von Nährstoffen im Körper verbessern kann. Säuren wie Zitronensäure unterstützen die Aufnahme von Mineralien und Vitaminen und fördern die optimale Funktion des Stoffwechsels. Trotz der potenziellen Vorteile gibt es auch Risiken, die mit dem Konsum von Säuren zur Hydratation verbunden sind. Zu viel Säure im Körper kann zu Magenbeschwerden, Sodbrennen oder anderen Verdauungsproblemen führen. Es kann auch zu einer Veränderung des natürlichen pH-Werts im Körper kommen, was langfristig gesundheitliche Probleme verursachen kann. Übermäßiger Konsum von Säuren kann auch die Schleimhäute im Mund und im Magen reizen und zu anderen gesundheitlichen Störungen führen. Daher ist es wichtig, Säuren nur in moderaten Mengen und unter Berücksichtigung des eigenen Gesundheitszustands zu konsumieren. Der Konsum von Säuren zur Hydratation ist eine unkonventionelle Methode, die von einigen Menschen in extremen Klimazonen oder unter besonderen Umständen angewendet wird. Obwohl es einige potenzielle Vorteile gibt, wie die Stabilisierung des Flüssigkeitshaushalts und die Unterstützung der Verdauung, sollten die Risiken nicht unterschätzt werden. Es ist wichtig, den Konsum von Säuren kontrolliert und in sicheren Mengen vorzunehmen, um gesundheitliche Probleme zu vermeiden. In vielen Fällen sind traditionelle Methoden wie das Trinken von Wasser oder das Tragen von geeigneter Kleidung bei heißen Temperaturen die sichersten und effektivsten Mittel, um eine Dehydrierung zu verhindern. In den meisten Rettungsgeschichten gibt es Momente der Angst, der Verzweiflung und der Unsicherheit. Doch es gibt auch Geschichten, die von Mut, Entschlossenheit und dem Willen zum Überleben zeugen. Dies war der Fall, als eine Rettungseinheit nach 2 Tagen der Suche endlich einen Ingenieur fand, der unter extremen Bedingungen in einem überfluteten Raum eingesperrt war. Diese außergewöhnliche Rettungsgeschichte ist ein Beweis für die Bedeutung von Rettungsmaßnahmen und den menschlichen Überlebenswillen. Es war ein normaler Arbeitstag, als der Ingenieur nach einem unerklärlichen Vorfall plötzlich als vermisst gemeldet wurde. Der Ingenieur war in einem Gebäude, das von einer unerwarteten Flut betroffen war. Das Wasser stieg schnell und es wurde angenommen, dass er entweder von den Fluten erfasst oder in einem sicheren Raum eingeschlossen war. 2 Tage vergingen und die Hoffnung schwand, dass er noch lebend gefunden werden könnte. Doch die Rettungseinheit gab nicht auf. Sie starteten eine umfassende Suchaktion, die sich über das gesamte Gebäude und das umliegende Gelände erstreckte. Das Team war entschlossen, den Ingenieur zu finden, und trotz der schwierigen Bedingungen und des steigenden Wassers blieb die Rettungsmannschaft optimistisch. Die Uhr tickte und jeder Moment war entscheidend. Am 2. Tag der Suche entdeckte das Rettungsteam ein schwaches Licht in einem Raum, der vollständig unter Wasser stand. Als sie näher kamen, bemerkten sie, dass das Licht aus einem Ingenieursbüro kam, das normalerweise von elektronischen Geräten betrieben wurde. Der Ingenieur hatte sich in diesem Raum aufrechterhalten können, indem er auf eine Notbeleuchtung angewiesen war, die in einigen modernen Gebäuden installiert ist. Das Rettungsteam war erstaunt, als sie realisierten, dass der Ingenieur sich in einem Raum unter Wasser befand, aber dennoch lebte. Das Licht, das sie entdeckten, war ein Hoffnungsschimmer, der die Rettungsmannschaft motivierte, weiterzumachen und das Leben des Ingenieurs zu retten. Nachdem das Team den Ingenieur lokalisiert hatte, begann die schwierige Rettungsaktion. Der Raum, in dem er sich befand, war vollständig überflutet und die Bedingungen waren alles andere als ideal. Die Rettungseinheit musste vorsichtig vorgehen, um sowohl die Sicherheit des Ingenieurs als auch ihre eigene zu gewährleisten. Sie mussten den Ingenieur aus dem überfluteten Raum befreien, ohne ihn unnötigen Gefahren auszusetzen. Es war ein Kampf gegen die Zeit, da das Wasser weiterhin stieg und die Gefahr bestand, dass das Gebäude noch weiter überfluten könnte. Trotz der Herausforderungen waren die Rettungskräfte entschlossen, den Ingenieur zu retten. Schließlich gelang es ihnen, den Ingenieur aus dem überfluteten Raum zu befreien und ihn in Sicherheit zu bringen. Der Ingenieur, der gerettet wurde, war sichtlich erschöpft, aber er hatte überlebt. Dank des schnellen Handelns und der Entschlossenheit des Rettungsteams war er nun sicher. Nach seiner Rettung wurde er sofort in ein Krankenhaus gebracht, wo er medizinisch versorgt und stabilisiert wurde. Es war ein Wunder, dass er trotz der extremen Bedingungen, unter denen er gefangen war, überlebt hatte. Die Geschichte dieses Ingenieurs und seiner Rettung ist nicht nur ein Beweis für die Bedeutung von Rettungsmaßnahmen, sondern auch ein Zeichen für die unermüdliche Entschlossenheit der Rettungsteams. Diese Teams arbeiten unter extremen Bedingungen, um Leben zu retten und die Hoffnung in den dunkelsten Momenten aufrechtzuerhalten. Die Rettung des Ingenieurs aus einem überfluteten Raum ist eine Geschichte von Mut, Hoffnung und Überlebenswillen. Trotz der extremen Bedingungen, unter denen er gefangen war, und der Herausforderungen, vor denen das Rettungsteam stand, konnte der Ingenieur gerettet werden. Diese Geschichte erinnert uns daran, dass das Leben auch in den schlimmsten Momenten einen Funken Hoffnung bereithält. Es zeigt die Bedeutung von Rettungsmaßnahmen und die unerschütterliche Entschlossenheit, Leben zu retten, egal wie schwierig die Situation auch sein mag. Nachdem Harrison nach dem dramatischen Vorfall im Ozean gerettet und aus dem Wasser gezogen wurde, begann der langwierige Heilungsprozess. Es war ein langer Weg zurück zur Gesundheit, sowohl körperlich als auch emotional. Das, was er durchgemacht hatte, hinterließ tiefe Spuren und es sollte viel Zeit und spezielle medizinische Betreuung erfordern, damit er wieder vollständig gesund wurde. Der Moment, als Harrison aus dem Ozean gerettet wurde, war nur der erste Schritt auf einem langen und schwierigen Weg der Genesung. Seine physischen Wunden waren schwer und die Gefahr einer Dehydrierung sowie der Schock nach dem Vorfall setzten ihm stark zu. Ärzte und Rettungskräfte wussten, dass es entscheidend war, Harrison langsam und behutsam in die normale Welt zurückzuführen. Intensive Pflege, Ruhe und Spezialbehandlungen waren erforderlich, um sicherzustellen, dass er körperlich wieder vollständig gesund wurde. Doch es war nicht nur der physische Heilungsprozess, der schwierig war. Die traumatischen Erlebnisse im Ozean und das Gefühl der Hilflosigkeit, das er während der gesamten Situation empfunden hatte, lasteten schwer auf ihm. Psychologische Betreuung wurde ebenfalls in den Heilungsplan aufgenommen, um sicherzustellen, dass er sich von den emotionalen und mentalen Narben erholen konnte, die der Vorfall hinterlassen hatte. Das Vertrauen in sich selbst und die Welt um ihn herum musste wieder aufgebaut werden. Während dieser Zeit war die Unterstützung von Familie und Freunden von unschätzbarem Wert. Harrison wusste, dass er nicht alleine war, dass es Menschen gab, die sich um ihn kümmerten und ihn ermutigten, weiterzukämpfen. Jeden Tag gab es kleine Fortschritte und das Team von Ärzten und Psychologen tat alles, um sicherzustellen, dass Harrison nicht nur körperlich, sondern auch emotional heilen konnte. Es war ein langsamer Prozess, aber jede kleine Verbesserung brachte neue Hoffnung. Nachdem Harrison sich körperlich stabilisiert hatte, stellte sich eine sehr wichtige Frage. Würde er jemals wieder den Ozean betreten? Die Antwort war eindeutig. Die traumatischen Erlebnisse, die er im Wasser durchgemacht hatte, hinterließen eine bleibende Angst, die er nicht überwinden konnte. Der Gedanke, wieder ins offene Wasser zu gehen, erfüllte ihn mit Angst und Unsicherheit. Es war nicht nur die Erinnerung an die Gefahr, der er entkommen war, sondern auch das tiefere Gefühl der Verletzlichkeit und der Angst vor der Unberechenbarkeit der Natur. Harrison entschloss sich schließlich, dass er nie wieder den Ozean betreten würde. Diese Entscheidung war eine, die er mit vielen Überlegungen und nach intensiven Gesprächen mit seinen Therapeuten und seiner Familie traf. Der Ozean hatte ihm alles genommen: seine Sicherheit, sein Vertrauen und einen Teil seiner Seele. Er wusste, dass er nicht in der Lage wäre, mit dieser Angst zu leben, wenn er sich wieder der unberechenbaren Natur aussetzen würde. Mit der Entscheidung, den Ozean nie wieder zu betreten, begann Harrison, sich auf ein neues Leben zu konzentrieren. Er fand Frieden in den alltäglichen Dingen des Lebens. Spaziergänge an Land, Zeit mit seiner Familie und die Rückkehr zu einer Routine, die ihn nicht an das Trauma erinnerte, halfen ihm, die Kontrolle über sein Leben zurückzugewinnen. Obwohl er die Erinnerungen an das, was er durchgemacht hatte, nie vollständig loslassen konnte, lernte er, mit ihnen zu leben. Harrison fand neue Wege, sich mit der Welt und der Natur auseinanderzusetzen, jedoch auf seine eigene Weise. Er begann, sich für den Schutz des Meeres und die Erhaltung der Natur einzusetzen, aber aus der Distanz. Der Ozean, so liebte er ihn auch früher, würde nie wieder ein Teil seiner eigenen Reise sein, aber er verstand die Bedeutung seiner Bewahrung und wollte dafür sorgen, dass andere Menschen sicher bleiben konnten. Harrisons Geschichte ist eine, die von Überlebenswillen, Heilung und der Kraft der Entscheidung spricht. Sie erinnert uns daran, dass der Weg der Heilung oft lang und voller Herausforderungen ist, aber auch, dass es wichtig ist, Entscheidungen zu treffen, die uns ein Leben ermöglichen, das wir kontrollieren können. Der Ozean war ein Teil seiner Vergangenheit, aber nicht mehr Teil seiner Zukunft. Harrison hat gelernt, dass wahre Heilung nicht nur körperlich ist, sondern auch die Fähigkeit bedeutet, sich selbst neu zu definieren und das Leben in die eigene Hand zu nehmen. Harrison wird nie wieder den Ozean betreten, aber er hat gelernt, dass das Leben auch ohne ihn weitergeht und dass er seinen eigenen Weg finden kann, um in einer Welt voller Möglichkeiten zu leben.